21 News, your place for politics. This is Decision 2024.
All right, with just days to go to Election Day, the voters are heading to the polls to vote early, or they are voting in person on November 5th. We are in crunch time, and one of the top issues among voters is the economy and inflation. But how well will their policies and promises really pan out in the economy if they get elected? This week, we're going to the experts to get the answers and to really dig into all of the issues a little deeper and how they would be reflected given whichever candidate is put in office. So joining us today on the 21 News Decision 2024 political panel, we have Bob Badowski, the chair of the School of Business at Westminster College, A.J. Sumell, economics professor at Youngstown State University. And next to me, as always, Justin Mitchell, 21 News analyst and assistant news director. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. We have a busy segment here ahead because this is the top issue that the voters do bring up, and we often report in the newsroom. It's kitchen table issues. It's the stuff that people, they're looking at their bills, they're voting on a lot of this, and so this is on their minds as they're either already voting early now or about to go mark their ballot in a few days. So they differ on their approach, the candidates, when it comes to how to handle this issue. Kamala Harris is promising higher tax credits for families with children and funding for first-time home buyers. Trump's approach is about lifting regulations and cutting government spending. So what could be the result of each of those approaches? Obviously, they're very different when, the candidates are making their case to the voters. AJ, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, yeah, they do have very different policies. I'd say one of the major differences between Trump and Kamala Harris is in how they plan to approach taxes, where Trump seems to put a lot of weight on the potential for applying tariffs to imports, and he's essentially promised to increase tariffs on imports by about 10%, like universal, and using that as a way to try to decrease the amount of taxes that we get from like income taxes. And most economists are actually opposed to this approach in terms of increasing tariffs for the simple reason that, well, if you're applying a tax, whether it's to an import or to a good that's produced here, it's going to increase prices. And studies have suggested that there's also, the potential to decrease the number of jobs, that are potentially destroyed as a result of these tariffs are greater than the number of jobs that are created. So most economists are not in favor of increasing tariffs because of the potential for inflationary pressures. But politically, it seems to be a relatively popular issue.
What about the increased spending? Let's say this adds more spending on the federal level. If Harris is elected, let's say that's the scenario. Would that also put pressure on the economy and add to inflation? How would that work out? Or would they have to remove something to replace that?
So yeah, if you look at the policies of both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, there's no doubt that both would actually increase the amount of the level of the deficit and the debt. And that could create inflationary pressure for both. For Kamala Harris, it's more based on a potential increase in spending, whereas for Donald Trump, it's more of a potential decrease in terms of taxes. But both would actually have inflationary pressure in terms of to the overall economy by increasing just the total amount of spending in the economy.
And Bob, you and I talk a lot, whether it's on 21 News at 5 or back in the day on the weekend, about some of this. When you look at both of the pitches that they're making to the voters, do you see any potential for a positive outcome? What could work and what may not work?
Well, I think they're both trying to help people, and I think they're just trying to do that differently. It's difficult when you're looking at these things, and because I look at it from an economist side, looking at like, oh, we're going to give $25,000 to first home buyers, which is great. But what happens when the government gives money to folks is the prices of houses go up by $25,000 across the board. So it's kind of that rule of unintended consequences. When you're giving money to folks, you want to help them, but at the same time, you might be hurting them. Kamala Harris is also looking at a $15 federal minimum wage. Again, that sounds fantastic, but as wages increase, so do prices. So, we have to kind of look at those unintended consequences. The same thing with Donald Trump, as he said. He's looking to look at imports and tariffs and things like that. But again, all that's going to do is companies are going to pass that on to consumers. So ultimately, we're going to hurt in the end if that happens. I know he's trying to bring business back to the United States by doing that, by saying we're going to kind of penalize you if you do business outside of the United States. So it would be better for you to manufacture here.
Right.
And that's kind of the whole point of this whole thing. But it's not going to happen overnight, and people are going to be hurting in the meantime.
And I want to zoom in on the tariffs. Justin, when we're reporting on this in the newsroom, there's the campaign angle where, okay, this is getting the attention of the voter, but then there's also the angle of how much does the consumer have the burden then later on down the line. So what is each candidate saying about tariffs in the latest reporting? And we're also talking about no taxes on tips. I mean, these are obviously tangible things that they want people to see and say, okay, there's a solution potentially for me.
Right. Well, the thing about so there is sort of a disconnect between what you hear from voters and what the maybe actual impact of a policy would be, or even what the situation on the ground may be. We recently did a story on the concept of a vibe session, where if you go around and ask people how the economy is doing, they are wildly more likely to say that it's doing terribly, even though by almost every indicator it's doing very, very well. Mm-hmm. So there's this disconnect. So these policies are floated to sound good to the voter, mm-hmm. and they don't necessarily always connect to what impact they will have. And that doesn't seem to matter in terms of elections because of this disconnect. Fact is economics is really complicated. It's why those guys are sitting there,
right.
and why we're sitting here.
Okay. Take some notes.
And so it's an advanced science that every little move has consequences, both intended and unintended. Mm-hmm. And yet voters, because they've got jobs and families to care for, they just want to know they can pay their bills. They can't think that deep into it. So they're looking for who's kind of offering the biggest piece of Halloween candy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're right, that there's just a big disconnect between the political reality and the economic reality. And the economic reality is always more complex than necessarily what politicians are saying, because they're saying what they think will appeal to voters. Whether that actually matches with the economic reality is something else. And so it might sound good, for example, to say that, well, we're going to apply tariffs and collect all of this money from other countries, whereas in reality, that what happens is these firms just pass those higher prices on to U.S. consumers. So even though the money's directly being collected from, say, China, what the burden of those tariffs actually is paid for by U.S. consumers in the form of higher prices.
And I know I spoke with both of you about the UAW and how this impacts the American auto workers, the American-made auto products, and we're one of those towns. And so I think a lot of the voters, when they're watching for some of that information to come out because they're retirees. They benefit from the auto companies doing well as well. They want to see them thrive. They're proud of the product they made their whole life. But if you tariff other auto vehicles or parts or whatever they're going to do, depending on whoever's in office, or push for the EVs, how do you think that would help the U.S. automakers? Is there anything that would move the needle to make them stronger in the long term? Or are they still in this global economy where really nothing is going to change because there's so much competition?
I think we're in a global economy. We've been in a global economy for a while, and that's kind of happened because labor was a lot cheaper in other places. There was less environmental regulation. So a lot of the things that we did to try to protect ourselves here in the United States with labor unions and you kind of having higher wages and EPA guidelines almost kind of forced companies to go abroad and produce things abroad. Now you'll see that a lot of the auto companies a lot of the stuff or a lot of pieces are made somewhere else, and they come back here and they're assembled here simply because it's easier just to ship the pieces rather than it is to ship the entire cars. But that's kind of where we are. And one of the things that they're both working on is housing. In a lot of places, housing is really difficult to build because of all of the different regulations. So a house that might have cost $100,000 or $150,000 now costs $300,000 because you've got this regulation upon this regulation upon this regulation. Some of those regulations are fine, and I think they're working, but some of those regulations seem to be government bloat.
Would the EV regulations and maybe the requirements, would that at all offset what's happening in that market? Let's say either candidate gets elected. So if it's Harris, she's going to, maybe support more of the green energy. Trump says he wants to tariff the other countries and any other vehicle coming in. And there is also the Biden administration's newest policy where they want to obviously put other requirements on the EV purchases. And that list is, not as long as it could be. What could maybe be the outcome of either of those scenarios, AJ?
Well, I think, I think any policy, it can have an impact for sure, but it's largely, I'd say, a marginal impact in terms of just slightly moving the needle one way or the other. That in the end, what's going to matter in terms of, like, for example, with the EV situation, so there's I think it's currently about a $7,500 credit, right? That people who purchase an EV can receive a direct tax credit after, and so sure that will influence some buyers and make them more willing to go ahead and purchase an EV. But it also, you have to take into account the fact that, well, that $7,500 credit, it doesn't decrease the price of EVs by $7,500, right? Because then EV makers actually increase the price in response to knowing that consumers are getting that $7,500 credit. It's kind of the inverse story of tariffs, that even though it's paid for by these foreign countries, the prices are passed on to consumers. In the same way, if consumers receive these subsidies, it's also benefiting the producers because they can charge higher prices to offset some of that. So in the end, any policy, sure, it can have an impact, but there's always going to be, I'd say, unintended consequences associated with any of them.
And is that what you're seeing with the EVs too? What did you notice when the past year we've had so much EV news, and we haven't meant to? It just is the news. We've had the winter weather slow down the vehicles with the batteries. We've got Ultium retooling its battery line because they want to make different EV batteries depending on we think whatever vehicle they're making or cheaper prices. They won't tell us everything.
Materials.
Right. So what do you think may be next for that sector, and what surprised you this year?
Well, we don't have the infrastructure for it. There are some spaces that have more infrastructure for EVs than others. We go to North Carolina every summer, and I think of if I had an EV, I would have to stop twice and fill this EV up 2 times, probably an hour to an hour and a half to maybe 2 hours. That's if I'm first in line. Then if I'm third in line, I might be stuck there for a while. So that kind of scares me a bit. What happens if I break down on the side of the highway? I run out of electricity, essentially. I can't go get a can of gas. So somebody's got to come get me and tow the car. So as of right now, I think they're wonderful as far as the output that they have. One, the infrastructure's not there, and 2, the electricity's got to come from somewhere. And I know they're built as a green thing, but where does the electricity come from? It comes from coal burning plants. It comes from those kinds of things. So when you kind of trace it back to where it comes from, and even some of the materials in the batteries are really highly toxic, and they don't, they come from people where they don't treat them very well as they mine those things. So there's a whole slew of problems with those as well.
And we'll talk about energy because that's my next question, and regulations, how that impacts the economy. Both parties are divided on how they want to approach energy regulations and also the consumption of energy. And when you think of this issue, this does kind of bring it right into the forefront. What do people want to purchase? Well, they have to have buying power too. And then you said they tack on the fee. So when it comes to energy, with each candidate, they're worlds apart. Is there one way or another right now that would impact the economy immediately, given what's happening overseas with oil prices and the oil supply and the energy supply?
So, yes, probably. I don't know about immediately. I think Trump, he famously said, "Drill, baby, drill." Right. So he wants to bring all the drilling back. He wants to open up the pipelines that were closed through the Biden administration, and that's not going to happen immediately. That'll take some time to get that up in gear if that actually does happen. But then that will put more oil into the world's market, which tends to then drop the prices because there's more supply, and if there's the same demand, then the prices of that oil or gas would fall. So I think you would probably see that, but you're not going to see an immediate impact on that. Now his plan is to do that and make shipping less expensive. Therefore, then the companies would potentially pass that on to the consumer, where it wouldn't be as expensive to truck your things from here to there.
What do you make of their policies when it comes to energy proposals? And also, these issues are trickling down into the Senate races and the statewide issues too. So whenever these lawmakers, whoever gets elected, goes to Congress, they're going to vote on a lot of things, and this may be one of them.
So, I mean, I think, they do have different emphases in terms of policies. I think, Donald Trump is more in favor of, like opening pipelines and trying to increase the domestic supply. But they both also, in some ways, are similar in terms of they have every type of energy source is good, right? In a sense that an all of the above kind of approach, where the more energy that we have and the more diversified our energy sector is, the better for consumers and for the economy, because we're not just reliant on one specific source of energy. So I think both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in favor of just increasing the diversification of our energy consumption and production.
Have a wider portfolio. How does that play out on the campaign trail? And in terms of our coverage, what have we heard locally? Because we used to be the hub of the fracking. I think you sent me to every fracking site there was in Trumbull County. My first few years of working here, I've seen every single one of them go up in person and then disappear. But we haven't seen that kind of activity, and people may be wondering, well, where is it? Why is that gone? One is in favor of more regulation over the other. Is that where we're at with that?
I think that's part of it. I mean, as for like all these fracking sites, that was maybe 12 years ago or something like that. But it's a lot of exploration. That's a very kind of touch and go. These companies buy up land hoping they find something there, and they've got a lot of money, so they can buy up that land. And a lot of areas around here didn't have what they thought it was going to have. Columbiana County had some. So in terms of what that means on the ground, this is kind of the quadrennial question, isn't it? Where everybody says, okay, well, it's a presidential election and I want lower gas prices, so I'm going for this candidate, which is, again, gets to the oversimplification of the issue, because there's only so much, even like everything you guys just said about, and that's assuming that they could get all of their policies done. They would take time, not be immediately apparent, and still be beholden to the rest of the world. So what you see again are people who are making decisions based on big promises and their best hope, and not necessarily the realistic likelihood that they're going to see what the candidates are saying, particularly when the promises are really grandiose.
And would that just also translate then to home heating costs as well, not just filling up your gas tank? Let's say energy, supplying energy to your home. Do you think that we may see more diversification in terms of that type of expense? We've heard about solar panels on roofs. Is that realistic in the current economy and the economy ahead, depending on who gets elected, or is that still a ways off?
Sure. I mean, I think, to Justin's point, a lot of it is totally independent of who is in office, right? It's just based on the technology, and in particular, like with solar power, for example, the costs are going down, and they've been going down substantially. It is becoming more of an actual option for consumers, where they could see a reduction in costs. And that is totally regardless of who the president is or the party in power. And not to say that it doesn't matter, but just a lot of the factors that in terms of affect consumers, like gas prices, for example, gas is a global market, and the president can't just force the price of gas to be lower because they want it to be lower. It's based on what's the international supply relative to the international demand, and that's out of the control of whoever wins the election.
Now, I will say also that at least particularly with regard to solar, wind, renewables versus traditional fossil fuels, that the impact often falls lower, like at the state level. For instance, in the state of Ohio, I mean, you talk about regulation, sometimes that's to thwart an industry, but sometimes it's to help one over another, because the laws in the state of Ohio are significantly more friendly towards the oil and gas industry than they are to the renewable industry right now. And that's, again, not the president, those are your state legislatures.
Yeah, you've got a moratorium on the windmills, and then also when it comes to the solar farms, they've given the power to the counties to then, regulate them out of the district if the county, if they want to completely, and the voters come in and, the commissioners or county council members, whichever county you have set up in Ohio, they listen to those voters and then make their decisions. So this is all the way down. And does that obviously slow down then exploration and new technology?
It does. Every bureaucratic, step that you have to go through slows you down, and that's sometimes the problem, but sometimes also helps. Somebody might go out rogue and try to do some things that they shouldn't be doing, but then you might have somebody who's actually trying to do something and they're getting stymied because of this regulation or that regulation. So, I think coming back to your idea of does the president really make a big difference? They have influence, absolutely, and they could try to influence different people in markets and things like that, but they don't rule by fiat. It's not the president's going to say oil prices shall be lower and that happens, right? There's a series of things that have to happen, or even with solar, a lot of that stuff comes from Congress, or like you said, the local legislatures. And unless you have a series of people pushing something in particular, very small likelihood that anything's going to change.
And they donate to both political parties, so it's not always one-sided either.
Right.
So we watch that closely in our newsrooms. One more thing I want to ask you about before I get to inflation, the big scary word that we always talk about, but I want to talk about the housing market. It is still seeing high prices. Obviously, inflation is putting pressure on this industry. You had alluded to the cost to make the homes, to build the homes. Trump's campaign says it will offer tax incentives for first-time home buyers and cutting regulation that they claim raises housing costs. Harris' campaign, according to her platform, says she's promising to provide first-time home buyers, and she mentioned this in the first, or her only debate, up to $25,000 to help with their down payments to people who are first-time home buyers. More could go, though, to first-generation home buyers. So which strategy maybe could work to really speed up progress in the housing market? Because we're not just seeing higher prices, we're seeing low inventory, and they play off each other. What do you think may be the solution? I think a lot of folks that want to jump in say, well, are the prices ever going to come down?
So, as far as I'm concerned, we need to remove some regulation. It doesn't hurt to help people get, into homes, but I don't think it's giving them a lump sum of money. Maybe it's lowering interest rates, because if you do the calculations for a house, a 7% interest rate versus a 3% interest rate is a world of difference, and it could be, depending on the price of the house, an extra $200,000-$300,000 that you pay over the life of that house, and a couple $100 extra a month in your monthly payment. So ultimately, that's what hurts, is the higher interest rates. Now there's a shortage in the market as well, so now you've got both things, right? So you've got the higher interest rates, you've got the shortage in the market, which is dragging up the price of houses, higher interest rates, so prices of housing are just going through the roof. And now I work with students all the time, and they're asking, like, do you think I'll ever be able to afford a house?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. You might not be able to afford the house, but you'll be able to afford a house. But right now, we need to figure out a way to kind of drag down those interest rates a bit.
And AJ, what do you think that these proposals could work?
So I think I think it's similar to the story like with gas. Like they can't just force the price to be lower. It's based on just the supply and demand of housing, and some of the policies can help so for example, like the $25,000 for first-time buyers, that helps obviously the people who receive that $25,000. But it can also just increase demand and actually increase the price of housing for everybody as a result. And so actually, in some ways, unintended consequences could be to increase overall prices of housing. But another policy that Kamala Harris has spoken about is just building more houses, right? And I think a proposal was, I think, 3 million, right? So in kind of the same way of, like drill, baby, drill, the point is to increase the supply to put downward pressure on prices. It's like build, baby, build, right? That by increasing the supply of housing, you do put downward pressure on prices. And so that could be an effective one. But it would also take time before the market can kind of adjust to that new supply.
And did you want to weigh in on that?
I actually had a question for you guys about that. To your point about building more houses, is there a way to offset the amount of time it would take? And I mean, is there a role for government to speed that process up? Almost sort of like a public works administration where they come up with some sort of a program to create jobs, build houses, and drive that down. Would that work, or is that?
I mean, it's obviously going to take time regardless, right? And so I do think some of the regulations and bureaucracy around it, like it's just easier to say, well, we're going to build this number of houses. In reality, well, where are you going to build them? You have to deal with local zoning laws, right? You have to deal with the actual construction of it. And so, it's like that idea of the political reality. Sure, it sounds good. And it might be a well-intended policy, but actually implementing it is a much different story. And it would take years, inevitably, even without the regulations, inevitably for those houses to be built and for it to have an effect in terms of overall prices.
What about the impact of the Obama-era tax credits to buy a home? Did those move the needle? Would that maybe be a better thing to propose, or would that not do much to get people in the market?
I mean, I think I think any of them move the needle, right? But it's more in a marginal way. I can't say as far as the research on the Obama era tax credits as far as the exact impact, but I think it's similar in terms of what's being proposed as far as it can help some people who receive them, but overall it doesn't have a great impact in terms of overall prices.
Okay, and a lot of folks are watching the prices. So when we end with the inflation, that's, I think, what a lot of people are watching, because we were dealing, I think in that era with Obama, we were dealing with the recession. Now, what we're seeing right now is inflation. That's the big word that we talk about all the time. And there are big prices tied to that word. I mean, if you go to the grocery store, people are feeling it. The local pantries, the school pantries, they say demand is significantly up, and they are concerned about people coming in. So we did have a new inflation rate come in today. The core inflation rate came in at 2.7%. It's up by 0.3%. The key inflation rate hit 2.1% in September. So do you think overall we're ever going to eventually start to see prices fall? And on everyday goods, have people feel again like they are getting ahead financially?
I don't think so in the short run. I think prices, because of COVID and because of supply chain shortages and things like that, and we're already kind of building on a high inflation rate already, so those prices have been inflated. I don't see those things coming down much. Now, there are stores and different initiatives from people to kind of draw down those prices a bit, but once prices are up, they tend not to come back down. They might drop them a few pennies or something like that, especially in a grocery store that has small margins to begin with. You look at a 1 to 3% margin on the things that you buy. So they're not really bilking their customers. They're just responding to the market of how they can buy things. And until you kind of fix that whole thing that happened, and I don't know if you're ever going to put the genie back in the bottle there, but we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it.
Is shrinkflation and attacking that, that's something that Sherrod Brown's running in his ads. Is that a way to go after the companies, or does that not really work economically? Does that ever bear fruit when it comes to results for stopping a company? There are statutes in certain states that the Harris campaign wants to build on, but can you really control what the companies are doing with the size of their products?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's largely based on the companies, and you can't, like in the same way, you can't mandate that companies charge different. I mean, you can. It's not a good policy, though, to say force a company to charge a lower price for their product, because they're going to charge the price that that allows them to be competitive and sustainable. And in that same way, you could try to put regulations on the quantity, but I think that's really, really difficult to do, to force companies to try to produce bigger packages or more of whatever it is that they're selling. I mean, in a large way, it is also not independent of who wins the presidency, but what happens with inflation in the future is going to be largely based on what's happening with the overall economy. It's going to be largely based on what the Federal Reserve decides to do with interest rates, which is independent of who wins the president. That the Federal Reserve, they're the ones that control the money supply. They're the ones that determine interest rates, and that's what really impacts inflation. And what's been happening is, it has been coming down substantially from where it was just a couple years ago. And it's close to where the Federal Reserve wants it to be, right? That their target is 2%. Right. So they're not trying to get prices to come down in a literal sense, right? They're trying to cause inflation to come down to where it's what's for a healthy economy, which is 2%.
Yeah, and we're dealing with a different scenario. 2020's election, we were in a pandemic and entering, an unknown time. Now we're exiting that time and dealing with the aftermath, which has been quite a roller coaster. And I think a lot of folks are watching this, and this will become research later on in history books. I'm sure you'll be teaching it in your classes. I really appreciate all of you joining me here. We learned a lot. I think we report on this a lot in the newsroom. And this is a topic that I think we always have a million questions about, but I really appreciate you joining me here on the Decision 2024 panel this week, as we're just literally days away from the election, people making decisions on important issues like this one, the ones that hit close to home. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me. It's good
All right,
discussion.
thank you, Justin. And you know what? We have this panel on YouTube. You can click and watch. Make sure you hit subscribe so you're watching all of the 21 WFMJ podcasts and videos. Also, you can see this on the 21 News app and WFMJ.com.